Chapter 3. The U-505 Commissioned. The U-505 story begins in the Deutsche Werft shipyard at Hamburg, Germany, where the sub's keel was laid on June 12, 1940. As they drove the first rivets in this new Seawolf's keel, Hitler's panzer divisions were roaring across France, sweeping all before them, apparently invincible. They had overrun Poland, conquered Norway, driven the British into the sea at Dunkirk, and within 2 days they would make their triumphant entry into Paris. There was just one barrier left to halt Hitler's conquest of Europe: the sea. In fact, it was just a small arm of the sea, the English Channel, only 18 miles across, that barred his victorious armies from England. The big question mark was, could this historic barrier still hold back the crushing power which the Luftwaffe and panzer divisions had just demonstrated to a stunned world? On many building ways in Germany, marauders similar to the U-505 designed to break this barrier were taking shape. On the very day that the keel of the U-505 was laid, French resistance collapsed. So, with world-shaking events occurring, no Nazi bigwigs were on hand for such a routine and unimportant event as the keel-laying of another submarine in Hamburg. The Luftwaffe and the panzers seemed irresistible. Few of the Nazi general staff doubted that the end of the war was close at hand. What difference did it make whether an extra U-boat keel was laid or not? History was in the making, and according to Hitler, the peace that would soon be signed would last for 1,000 years. 2 days after the keel laying, the conquering German armies entered Paris. Hitler danced his little jig in the Compiègne forest, and there were many who thought that this U-boat and her sister ships, then being rushed to completion, would never see action in this war. How wrong they were. History followed its time-honored habit of repeating itself, and the panzer divisions remained poised on the French side of the English Channel for the next 3 years. The Luftwaffe crossed the Channel almost at will and rained death and destruction on London, Coventry, Plymouth, and many other English cities. But control of the seas, precarious though it was, saved England from invasion just as it had over 100 years before, when Napoleon, another conquering ex-corporal who didn't understand sea power, had seen his legions halted opposite the cliffs of Dover. Thanks to sea power, the British bled and sweated it out, and conquered Hitler. So although Denmark, Holland, Belgium, and France were crushing to defeat when her keel was laid, construction of the U-505 proceeded apace during the eventful year which followed. During that year, the Luftwaffe fought and lost the air battle of Britain. They inflicted grievous punishment on the civil population of England by aerial bombing, but they paid a heavy price to the fighter defenses, and it became obvious they could not win by aerial bombing alone. Hitler reluctantly abandoned his plans for invading England when his air marshals and admirals could not guarantee safe passage across the Channel for his invading force. 18 miles of salt water, which could be crossed in a couple of hours, but which were dominated by the Royal Navy and the RAF, stopped the Wehrmacht, which had blitzed Poland in the Low Countries and had made the impregnable Maginot Line a laughingstock. Meantime, the fall of France enabled Dönitz to move his U-boat bases from Germany to the Biscay coast of France. This was a welcome break for Dönitz, because things were getting too hot for him close to the shores of England. The RAF had learned a lot since the war began, and it was necessary for him to shift his zone of operations further out into the Atlantic, beyond the range of shore-based aircraft. This increased the distance to the hunting ground by about 1,000 miles per round trip, but the shift to Biscay bases evened it up again. So far, the war at sea had been indecisive, a mere preview of what was to come. The Allies had lost 374 ships totaling 1.5 million tons, but this was hardly enough to even cause food rationing in England. The German seaborne traffic, except with Sweden and Norway, had been completely cut off. But Hitler had conquered so much new territory and acquired so many new resources that he didn't feel the pinch of the Royal Navy's blockade too badly. Yet. The war had reached a temporary stalemate. England had braced herself for a last-ditch fight on the beaches, the hills, and in the streets, if Hitler's conquering panzers ever got across the Straits of Dover. During the first 10 months of war, the size of the U-boat fleet had remained static. 23 new boats joined the fleet, but 23 had been sunk. However, the number of U-boats available for operations decreased because half of the fleet had to be assigned to training new crews for the great building program, then getting into high gear. When the U-505's keel was laid, Allied shipyards were still in low gear, but U-boat production was building up to 30 per month. For the next year, the U-boat fleet was growing rapidly, and our total merchant fleet decreased by nearly 3 million tons. When Dönitz moved his zone of operations out into the broad Atlantic, new tactics became necessary. While close to England, where shipping lanes converged, his U-boats had operated as lone wolves, simply waiting near the bottlenecks for the shipping to come to them. But out in the open sea, where the convoy routes could be shifted around, lone wolf operations didn't pay off because too much depended on the luck of the hunt. One boat might intercept a convoy and make a killing, while a sister boat patrolling only 50 miles away might see nothing and bring all her torpedoes back to port. Dönitz had an ace up his sleeve, the Rudeltaktik, or wolf pack, which he had worked out in pre-war exercises. This was a revolutionary concept which recognized that to get the most out of submarines, they had to be operated as surface vessels most of the time, and which took a well-calculated risk in discarding radio silence. Dönitz headquarters took over operational control of the boats at sea and spread them out in a long line on the surface across the convoy lanes. When one of the boats sighted a convoy, he no longer drove and submerged and expended all his torpedoes. He stayed on the surface and shadowed the convoy, keeping the masts in sight just over the horizon, reporting by radio to Dönitz. Dönitz rebroadcast the convoy's position, course, and speed to other boats on the line, and they converged on their prey at high speed on the surface. Often they were guided in by homing signals from the shadower, who, being out of range of shore-based aircraft, could get away with this. When 5 or 6 boats had assembled on each flank of the convoy, Dönitz would turn them loose to charge into the convoy at night, overwhelming the escorts by sheer weight of numbers. This seems very simple and logical, as I describe it now, but when Dönitz did it, it was a complete break with previous submarine practice in all navies. Submarines were traditionally lone wolves, and radio silence was a sacred cow. This daring shift in tactics caught the Allies unprepared, and Dönitz's new idea met with immediate spectacular success. For the next 2 years, the Wolfpacks took a terrible toll from our convoys in the North Atlantic. German histories of the war refer to the nights of October 18 and 19, 1940, as the Night of the Long Knives. On these 2 nights, a pack of 12 U-boats, led by the 3 great aces Prien, Schepke, and Kretschmer, ripped into 2 convoys like a pack of hungry wolves, turned loose in a flock of sheep. A nautical version of Dante's Inferno was enacted out in the cold Atlantic several hundred miles from the English coast. After lurking on the surface all day, just beyond the horizon, the pack struck with unprecedented fury after dark. Surfaced U-boats charged back and forth through the convoy like the horsemen of the apocalypse, firing torpedoes right and left. Star shells lit up the sky, guns of all caliber blasted away, and the muffled thunder of torpedo explosions and depth charges reverberated all night. For hours, there were scenes of wildest confusion. Tankers blew up with flash mushroom explosions that were previews of the atom bomb, and subsided into flaming beacons on the surface of the sea that burned for hours, giving a garish light for the continuing nightmare. Ships, maneuvering wildly to avoid torpedoes, rammed and sank each other. Gun crews firing at U-boats racing between columns of the convoy shot into ships in the adjacent column. Escort vessels pursuing the U-boats were mistaken for subs and shot up by ships in the convoy they were trying to protect. The escorts were utterly futile that night and didn't damage a single U-boat. The merchant ships which escaped slaughter did so simply because there weren't enough attackers to sink them all. Seamen whose ships were shot out from under them did not suffer long in the bitter cold sea that night. After 5 minutes or so in near-freezing water, the body becomes numb and death comes fairly comfortably in about 15 minutes. Tanker crews had their bodies freeze while their heads, faces, and hands were being burned to a crisp by the flaming oil that covered the surface of the sea. There were few survivors from torpedoed ships, and most of them had both arms and legs frostbitten beyond repair. The doctors clipped them off neatly, close to their bodies. For the merchant sailors, these were nights of panic, with unseen terror striking out of the blackness time and time again from all sides. Survival was a matter of blind luck, as torpedoes fired from the center of the convoy often missed their intended targets, but hit ships in the next column. Blazing tankers illuminated friend and foe alike, but the black submarines with decks awash were much harder to see than the great cargo ships, and a conning tower is a tiny target for a gun crew on a rolling ship. For Schepke, Prien, and Kretschmer, these nights were wild orgies of power and victory. When the gray dawn of October 19 ended the slaughter, 32 ships out of 83 in the two convoys had been sunk. A total of 150,000 tons went to the bottom in the most overwhelming success of the Battle of the Atlantic for Dönitz and his 3 great aces. To the Germans, the Night of the Long Knives is one of the high spots in their naval history. But to Davy Jones' cold-blooded accountants, it is merely an incident in the great table of statistics compiled at the bottom of the sea, recorded in their barnacle-covered ledger simply as October 18 in 1940. Convoys SC-7 and HX-79 through 32 ships. 150,000 tons. Numerous similar incidents would be recorded in the next few years, but none equal to the Night of the Long Knives. 6 months later, in March of 41, the British exacted poetic vengeance for this night of terror. Up to that time, they had sunk a total of 31 U-boats in 19 months, but for the past 3.5 months had not sunk a single one. Between 8 and 17 March, they sank 3. These 3 sinkings were consecutively recorded on the Admiralty's master list as follows. Date, 8th of March, U-boat, U-47, cause of sinking, HMS Wolverine, position, 60 degrees, 47 degrees north, 19 degrees, 13 degrees west. Date, 17th of March, U-boat, U-99, cause of sinking, HMS Walker, 61 degrees north, 12 degrees west. Date, 17th of March, U-boat, U-100, cause of sinking, HMS Walker, Vannock, 61 degrees north, 12 degrees west. U-47 was Prien, U-99, Kretschmer, and U-100, Schepke. The 3 great aces were swept off the board in 9 days. This was the heaviest blow of the war so far to Dönitz, and to the morale of his whole U-boat fleet. Prien and Schepke went down with their boats. Kretschmer was captured and spent the rest of the war in prison camp. He is now a Kapitan zur, see in the new German army. Kretschmer's capture is of interest in this story of the U-505. He was cornered at night while stalking a convoy by 2 British destroyers, one of which had just killed Schepke half an hour before. Badly damaged by depth charges while submerged at 300 feet, He lost control of his boat, and she started toward the bottom in thousands of fathoms of water. He had the choice of sacrificing himself and his crew by simply riding her down to crushing depth, or of blowing his tanks, bringing her to the surface, and giving his crew a chance to be rescued. He chose the latter and broke surface very close to the two destroyers. When he came up, he was helpless and intended simply to surrender and scuttle. But there was no way the destroyers could know this, especially at night. Ordinarily, a cornered submarine is treated the same way as a cornered tiger. Surrender is impossible for either of them. The British opened fire on U-99, and for 10 or 15 minutes, Kretschmer and his crew huddled on deck behind the bridge, while the destroyers blasted away. When the British finally realized the U-boat was out of action and ceased fire, Kretschmer sent his crew below to put on warm clothing before going overboard. For another 15 minutes or so, the U-boat and the two destroyers wallowed in the darkness, eyeing each other suspiciously. Finally, one destroyer drifted down very close to U-99 and seemed to be lowering a boat. Kretschmer sent his engineering officer below to open the vents and scuttle. The engineer did his duty well and went down with the boat. Kretschmer and the rest of his men were fished out of the water and taken to England. The question arises, what would have happened if the destroyers had lowered whale boats and sent armed boarding parties over as soon as U-99 surfaced? Your guess on this is as good as mine. There is at least a possibility that U-99 might have been boarded and captured. I bring this up because some people in Germany are critical now of the U-505's crew for allowing their boat to be captured. But Kretschmer, the greatest ace of all, lay helpless on the surface for half an hour with destroyers within hailing distance before scuttling his boat. The crew of the U-505 behaved just about the same as Kretschmer's crew. The difference in the final outcome of these two engagements resulted not from what the German crews did or didn't do, but from what their enemy did. In May of 1941, another one of the epic incidents of the battle at sea occurred when the giant battleship Bismarck almost got loose in the Atlantic. The panic button in the Admiralty was held down for a week while this great ship was making her break north and west of Iceland for the convoy lanes. The Bismarck was the most powerful surface ship ever built up to this time. She displaced at least 50,000 tons, had 8 15-inch guns, could make 30 knots, and was so heavily armored and so well subdivided that she was almost unsinkable. Had she gotten loose along the convoy lanes, she would have been like a bull in a china shop. She could have paralyzed our transoceanic commerce as long as she remained at large. She was intercepted and brought to action in the Denmark Strait between Iceland and Greenland by HMS Hood in Prince of Wales. The Hood had been the pride of the British Navy and symbol of England's sea power for 25 years. She was the most impressive-looking warship in the world, had the same main battery as the Bismarck, was about the same size, and could make 30 knots. But she was a glass-jawed heavyweight with light armor and had no business with gun range of a tough customer like the Bismarck. The British Admiralty should have known this. The Bismarck's second salvo blew up her magazines. The Hood disintegrated in a huge ball of fire, and only 3 out of her crew of 1,500 survived. The Bismarck shifted her sights to the Prince of Wales, a brand-new battleship, heavily armored, and with gun power equal to her own. Within minutes, she staggered the second heavyweight with hits that knocked out half her battery and made a shambles of her bridge. The Prince of Wales put her helm over and reeled out of action. At this point, the German admiral threw away one of the greatest opportunities ever given to a German naval officer. Had he pursued the Prince of Wales, he would probably have sunk her too, but he was a literal-minded man of no vision. His orders were to break out into the Atlantic and when the Prince of Wales limped off and left his path clear, he bugged out and headed for the wide-open sea. He didn't make it. After a 3-day game of hide-and-seek involving every ship and airplane the British could muster, the Bismarck was cornered while trying to get into the Brest and was hammered to pieces by an overwhelming armada. The savage punishment which she absorbed was unbelievable. The British literally held target practice on her at point-blank range with their heaviest naval guns, but couldn't sink her. They finally put her on the bottom by pumping torpedo after torpedo into her helpless, wallowing hulk. Looking back on this affair now, it was a grim comedy of errors on both sides. The German admiral should have sunk the Prince of Wales and then have gone back to Germany to become a hero of the fatherland, greater even than Prien. Instead, after proceeding too far into the Atlantic to turn back to Germany, he decided that superficial damage to the Bismarck required him to head for the dockyard at Brest. Although he had actually given the British the slip by this time, he thought British cruisers were still trailing him. Convinced that his location was known, he opened up on his radio to send a lot of dramatic messages to Hitler, thus revealing his position to the alert direction finder system of the Admiralty. Soon the British, still seeing red from their humiliation in Denmark Strait, lowered the boom savagely on the garrulous German admiral. There were many flagrant bloopers on the British side, too. The explosion of the Hood duplicated the explosions of the 3 similar British battle cruisers 25 years before at Jutland. The mills of the Admiralty grind slow, but you might think that in 25 years they would get around to reading the action reports of World War I. In addition, the British were within hours of having to call off the chase for lack of fuel when the Bismarck was finally cornered. Refueling at sea was commonplace in the U.S. and German navies at this time, but the successors of Nelson are slow to adopt ideas that other navies think of first, and the British had not yet taken up this newfangled business. On the day before the Bismarck was finally sunk, a squadron of torpedo planes from a British aircraft carrier mistook one of their own heavy cruisers for the Bismarck and fired a salvo of 12 torpedoes at her. They all missed. Finally, when the Bismarck was reduced to a helpless, battered hulk that refused to sink, no one even thought of trying to put a tow line aboard and drag this priceless token of victory back to England. There is one other improbable incident of this battle, which is worth telling in a book about submarines. The U-556 was known throughout the submarine flotillas as the Bismarck's little brother. One day in the Baltic, the U-556 had met the Bismarck on her shakedown cruise and sent a rather flippant message from captain to captain. When a brusque reply came back demanding the U-boat skipper's name, he replied, "I'll bet you can't do this," and submerged until the Bismarck was well out of sight. Sometime later, the bumptious sub-skipper paid a formal call on the captain of the Bismarck and presented him with a certificate saying the U-556 would look after and protect the Bismarck wherever she went. The young sub-skipper's bravado broke the crust of the Bismarck's captain, and a firm friendship was thus established between the giant battleship and the U-boat. On the day before the Bismarck was cornered and sunk, U-556 was returning from a war patrol in the Caribbean, running submerged, when the Renown and Ark Royal, racing to intercept the Bismarck, steamed smack across her course 500 yards ahead of her. The setup was a U-boat skipper's dream, an unescorted battleship and aircraft carrier at point-blank torpedo range, unaware of the U-boat's presence. But the U-556 had expended all her torpedoes. To cap the climax, it was a torpedo hit a few hours later by a plane from the Ark Royal that finally sealed the Bismarck's fate, jamming the battleship's rudder when she had almost made good her escape. The Bismarck's little brother had promised a little more than he was able to deliver. Just a month later, When starting off for her next cruise, U-556 joined the Bismarck in the mud at the bottom of the sea, not far from the spot where her big brother had sunk the hood. On May 25, 1941, the day that the U-556 failed her big brother, and the day before the Bismarck was sunk, a new U-boat slid down the ways in Hamburg, the U-505. It was just 2 weeks short of a year since her keel had been laid. Incidents such as the Night of the Long Knives, the end of the Three Aces, and the killing of the Bismarck added color and drama to the war at sea, but the real battle dragged on methodically and relentlessly day after day with the fate of the Western nations at stake. These things and others that happened on the surface, the great convoys plodding back and forth, wolf packs prowling, hideous night battles, narrow escapes, and drifting wreckage and lifeboats were all just incidents. The final score was kept down at the bottom of the sea. When the U-505 was ready to go in commission on August 20, 1941, the box score of Davy Jones' accountants since the beginning of the war was as follows. Allied merchant vessels sunk, 1,653. Tonnage lost, 8 million. New construction, 3 million. Net loss, 5 million. New U-boats commissioned, 153. U-boats sunk, 40. Net gain, 113, plus 57 original boats equals 170 total in fleet. The U-boats were getting the upper hand. Food was now strictly rationed in England, and another year or so of blockade by a steadily growing U-boat fleet might force her to the wall. But Hitler couldn't wait. A maniacal urge drove him on, and when he was stopped in one direction, he had to lash out in another. He couldn't get across the channel to finish England quickly. Blockade is a slow process, so he launched his attack on Russia. The frantic pleas of his military advisers against the Russian campaign had little effect anymore. They had advised against every major move he had made so far, and every move had hit the jackpot. Who could blame him for thinking he had a magic touch and was infallible? On August 26, 1941, more than a year after France surrendered, the U-505 was commissioned at Hamburg, Captain Lieutenant C. Axel Lowe commanding. By this time, the war with Russia was in full swing, but the slogan inscribed on the first page of the U-505's guest book, now in a glass case at the Museum of Science and Industry, reads, "Wir fahren gegen England." We are sailing against England. Actually, they were going 4,000 miles further than England. But not even in their zaniest nightmares could any of the U-505's crew foresee that she would end up among the trees next to a museum in Chicago. What they did think about is indicated by the following jingle translated from the early pages of the U-505 guest book. It was written the day she was commissioned. Each of the various guests at the ceremony and visiting officers from sister ships composing and signing one verse. 10 proud British merchantmen cruising in a line. Along came U-505, and then there were 9. Amfort, Oberlut, Zersee. 9 proud British merchantmen with lookouts not awake. The U-505 caught 1, and then there were 8. Ingemann, Oberlut, Ing. 8 proud British steamers at 11:15. When we squeeze the firing switch, then there are 7. Harburg, Lieutenant Zersee. 7 British cargo ships loaded to their sticks, but after our torpedo hits, there were only 6. Schneewind, Oberlieutenant Zersee. 6 proud British freighters, running for their lives. 1 lagged behind, and then there were 5. Wook, Lieutenant Zersee, U-656. 5 big British steamers almost at the shore. The 505 released an eel, and then there were 4. Rolf Fostborn, Lieutenant Zersee. 4 proud British steamers were sighted by our crew. We dive and fire a double shot, and then there are 2. Bonner, Lieutenant Xerxes. 2 British freighters, a big one and a small. Low shot the big one down, so then only 1. Hans Schult, Lieutenant Xerxes. 1 little freighter arrived at Portsmouth then. The BBC and Reuters announced there were 10. The moral of this story is, don't believe what you read in the British newspapers. The next entry in the guest book turns time back 25 years for any naval man, no matter what his country. May the boat live up to the motto of the Seydlitz, always in the lead. Signed Putra, formerly gunner SMS Seydlitz, 26 August 1941. The Seydlitz was one of the Kaiser's 5 battle cruisers at the Battle of Jutland in the First World War. Even today, if you mention Jutland to a British naval officer, his blood pressure goes up. He clears his throat and emphatically claims that this battle was a strategic victory for the British. But the German High Seas Fleet, outnumbered 2-1, escaped behind its minefields after inflicting losses on the Grand Fleet over twice as heavy as it sustained. Churchill, dutifully but half-heartedly defending the British commander-in-chief in this action, says, "He was the only man who could have lost the war in an afternoon by getting his whole fleet sunk. But he could also have shortened it 2 years if he had been willing to get in there and fight." The thing that saved the day for the Germans in this great battle, perhaps the last fleet action that will ever be fought, was the so-called death ride of the battle cruisers. These battle cruisers, including the Seydlitz, were in the lead at Jutland and bore the brunt of the attack by the British Grand Fleet. The Derfflinger, Mulk, Seydlitz, von der Tann in Lützow threw themselves into the path of the oncoming Grand Fleet and held it off for a few minutes while the High Seas Fleet extricated itself from an impossible situation. Even the British acknowledge this is an epic incident in naval warfare. 25 years later, in the guest book of the U-505, an unreconstructed survivor of the death ride wishes the next generation of German soldiers luck and reminds them that they have great traditions to live up to. By the time the above was written, it seemed that the U-505 might have to hurry if she was to carry out these sentiments. The Panzer armies had proven invincible, and it looked as if they would soon overwhelm Russia. The war at sea had settled down to the grim, relentless, and long-drawn-out business of a starvation blockade. As soon as Russia was conquered, Hitler would turn on England again, and then it would be up to the German Navy to get the Panzer armies across that narrow stretch of salt water in the Straits of Dover, which the British Army crossed when they evacuated Dunkirk. During the invasion of England, many Knight's Crosses and oak leaves would be won, and all hands in the U-505's crew wanted to take part in this operation and share in the glory. By August of 41, the United States was waging an undeclared war against U-boats in the North Atlantic. Lend-Lease was supplying the British with arms. We had swapped them 50 destroyers for bases in the Western Hemisphere, and our own destroyers were escorting British convoys, hunting out and depth-charging U-boats. But Hitler didn't want to fight us at this time and refused to let his admirals retaliate against us. They were now waging unrestricted U-boat warfare against all non-Axis ships in the North Atlantic, but he forbade attacks on U.S. ships in our home waters. His master plan when the U-505 was commissioned was to defeat Russia and then dispose of England, and to deal with the United States after that. I was in England as an observer before we got into the war in October 1941. I remember well the grave faces in the Admiralty the morning the aerial photographs of submarine building yards were evaluated, showing that U-boat production would soon reach 30 per month. England had plenty of battleships and cruisers to ensure control of the surface of the sea, but these were useless for protecting convoys against submarines. They were worse than useless because whenever one of them put to sea, she had to have a heavy destroyer screen to protect her against submarines, thus reducing the number of escorts available to escort vital convoys. The steadily growing U-boat fleet now numbered 200, and the Admiralty was badly scared. Everybody at the meeting that morning did some simple mental arithmetic, and their faces got longer when they did. By this time it was apparent that the gallant British people could grit their teeth and take whatever punishment the Luftwaffe could deal out to them. But even the bravest people cannot hold out indefinitely against starvation, and the noose of the U-boat blockade was getting tighter each week. From a long-range point of view, this expanding U-boat fleet, to which the U-505 was the latest addition, was a much more deadly threat to England than the Luftwaffe or the Panzer divisions. Chapter 4. Inside a Submarine. The U-505 Hull 295 of the Deutsche Werft shipyards, Hamburg, was a type of IXC boat, 252 feet long, displaced 1,100 tons when fully loaded, and carried a crew of 4 officers and 56 men. She could make 19 knots on the surface, running on her diesel engines, and could stay at sea for 90 days, cruising at economical speed. She was of the pre-Schnorkel type, which could not run on diesel engines when submerged, but had to use her electric motors driven by a battery. This battery had to be recharged at least every 24 hours, and this could only be done by surfacing and running the diesel engines. She carried 21 torpedoes, each capable of sinking any ordinary merchant ship, and had 4 tubes forward and 2 aft. When commissioned, she had a 4.1-inch gun just forward of the conning tower, but this was later removed and replaced by anti-aircraft guns. Before we go to the Baltic with the U-505 to watch her crew shaking down, let's take a look inside this strange denizen of the deep. Some scientists tell us man's ancestors were creatures that originated in the ocean's depths. If so, we have long since lost our ancestors' feeling of security underwater. Even sailors who spend their lives on the surface of the ocean are regarded as a queer lot, and submarine sailors are a breed apart. Man is now a dry land creature, and to most people a submarine is an eerie, mysterious vessel. Usually we think of a submarine as a craft designed to spend most of its time submerged, but the World War II submarine was actually a surface craft which could, when necessary, operate submerged for short periods of time. In an emergency, to escape an attack, it could go down to 500 or 600 feet, but it couldn't stay there long, and it couldn't move very far while it was down there. It was a lightly armored surface warship, endowed with a special cloak of invisibility, which she could wrap herself in and disappear when the going got tough on the surface. Like any ship, it had to provide space and facilities for the crew to live, eat, and sleep. It also had to be able to propel itself through the water and to perform some useful function in this world, such as blowing up and sinking merchant ships. It takes a lot of complex equipment to do this, and a modern submarine crams more men, machinery, and equipment into less space than any other vehicle designed by man. The pressure hull of a submarine contains all the living spaces, machinery, and essential equipment. It is a tough steel cylinder, about 10 times as long as it is in diameter, divided internally into 6 watertight compartments by athwartship bulkheads, with a long narrow fore and aft passageway running from bow to stern. Circular doors 3 feet in diameter permit passage through the bulkheads. Amidships, it has a stubby conning tower sticking up, which is also part of the pressure hull. Inside this hull, the air pressure is always just about atmospheric. Outside is the sea pressure corresponding to the depth at which the boat is operating. At 500 feet, it is 16 tons per square foot of surface. The pressure hull must be a rugged structure to withstand such tremendous compression, and if it ever cracks and admits seawater, the sub will be on the bottom of the ocean permanently in a few minutes. A submarine has 2 powerful diesel engines, a pair of heavy electric motors, a huge storage battery, and many pumps. It has torpedo tubes, complex fire control gear, and intricate radio, radar, and listening equipment. When you jam all this stuff inside the pressure hull, plus spare parts, labyrinths of pipes, wires, valves, switches, gauges, and meters, plus 60 men and their belongings, plus food and fuel for 3 months, and then add the streamlining structure necessary to let it make some speed through the water, and put a few guns and other useful pieces of machinery on this structure, the cylinder is just barely buoyant enough to float. Only the bridge would stick out of the water, and her decks would be awash. Attached to the outside of the pressure hull are large tanks which the submariners call ballast tanks. This term is confusing to the layman because they are really buoyancy tanks, which, when empty, supply the flotation necessary to keep the heavy pressure hull afloat with her weather decks dry. These tanks have sea valves in the bottom and air valves on the top. When you open both the valves in the vents, seawater comes in, forcing the air out through the vents. The tanks lose buoyancy, and the submarine sinks. Theoretically, if you let in just exactly the right amount of water, she will sink until only a half-inch of the periscope sticks out of the water. But in practice, you can't do this. It isn't possible to gauge the weight of the boat and the amount of water admitted that closely. If you admit just a gallon or so too much water and do nothing about it, the sub will start sinking slowly, but with a gradually increasing rate until the pressure hull collapses, which in the U-505 type sub would happen around 1,000 feet. The reason is that seawater is not compressible, but steel is. As the sub sinks deeper and the pressure on the hull increases, the steel cylinder compresses slightly. This small compression decreases the buoyancy, which is already negative, and so she sinks faster. The sinking can be stopped either by admitting compressed air to the ballast tanks and blowing water out, by pumping it out mechanically, or by driving the boat through the water and using the bow and stern planes to produce dynamic lift and hold the boat up as the wings of an airplane do, which is how it is almost always done in practice. When a sub dives, she admits not quite enough water in the ballast tanks to sink her, and then pulls herself down by use of her diving planes. Then if something goes wrong and she loses power, she will float back up to the surface. Sometimes it is possible for a sub to remain at rest completely submerged without using the diving planes and without juggling the ballast. The density of seawater usually is nearly constant, but the sea is moody and doesn't always behave according to its own rules. Occasionally, you can find a submerged layer of cold, extra-heavy water, and if you settle onto it gently enough with just a few pounds of negative buoyancy for the warmer water, the heavier cold water will hold you there suspended motionless. The only other way you can remain motionless submerged is to sit on the bottom in water shallower than your crushing depth. The ballast tanks are not nearly as sturdily built as the pressure hull because they always have sea pressure both inside and outside, so they have no tendency to crush with increased depth. The same is true of the external fuel tanks, which are open to the sea at the bottom. Oil being lighter than water, it floats on top of the seawater, and as you use up oil, the seawater rises higher in the tanks. Pressure inside and outside of these tanks is equal, as it is in the ballast tanks. The whole structure of the pressure hull and its ballast and fuel tanks is enclosed in a light steel envelope of gingerbread, which also never has to resist any unequal pressures. Its main purpose is to streamline the boat, furnish support for the outside weather deck and guns, and stowage space for things carried externally, such as the anchor windlass, extra torpedoes, life rafts, etc. A pre-snorkel submarine of the U-505's type runs on its diesel engines when surfaced, but she must stop the diesels before she submerges. A diesel engine uses a lot of air, and the instant the conning tower hatch is closed for submerging, air in a submarine becomes a precious thing in short supply. If you slam the conning tower hatch and air inductions closed and submerge with the diesels running full speed, You would suck all the air out of the boat in a few seconds. Toward the end of the war, the schnorkel made it possible for submarines to run their diesels when submerged just below the surface. A schnorkel is simply a long steel pipe that sticks up about as high as a periscope and allows the diesels to suck air down from the surface into the U-boat. But this great improvement came too late for the U-505. When she submerged, she had to switch to her electric motors, which drew their power from a huge storage battery. This battery, weighing over 100 tons, could drive her for about 24 hours at slow speed, or a much lesser period at high speed. At her most economical speed, there was enough juice in the battery to take her about 60 miles submerged. The only way pre-schnorkel subs could recharge their batteries was by running their diesel engines, which turned over the electric motors, acting as generators, and put energy back into the battery. When the battery got low, a pre-schnorkel sub had to surface for 2 to 3 hours to recharge the battery. As will be explained later, this was one of the major facts of life about that type of submarine. A submarine torpedo is a miniature version of the boat itself, similar in all respects to the parent vessel, except that, no crew space being necessary, the whole interior is jammed with machinery, explosives, and mechanical brains. The standard torpedo at the beginning of the war was driven by compressed air, had a range of 4 to 5 miles, and could make 30 knots. This torpedo left a telltale white wake of air bubbles behind it, and thereby often gave its target warning of its approach. Later, the Germans developed an electric torpedo, driven by a storage battery, which left no wake. The early torpedoes were straight-running missiles, which had to be carefully aimed, allowing for the course and speed of the target vessel. If the target zigged or zagged after this torpedo was fired, the torpedo would miss. Later, the acoustic torpedo, equipped with mechanical ears, which picked up the sound from the target vessel's screws, could maneuver to make the sound equal in both ears, and thus home on the source of the noise. It was only necessary to aim it in the general direction of the target and turn it loose. No careful analysis of target course and speed was necessary, and a zigzagging target didn't bother it a bit. This was a deadly thing until we learned how to counter it. The electric acoustic torpedo was worse than a rattlesnake for a while, giving no warning and never missing. It was the first guided missile developed by man. It was the embryo from which whole families of airborne guided missiles are now developing. These modern missiles, in one form or another, are simply aerial torpedoes. But instead of sinking one ship and its crew, these missiles with atomic warheads can blast a whole city of 1 million human beings into eternity without warning. Civilization progresses rapidly these days. The counter to this first guided missile, the acoustic torpedo, was ridiculously simple. When we finally thought of it, we just towed raucous noisemakers on a long cable astern of our ships. The torpedoes homed obediently on the loudest noise they heard and blew their own brains out harmlessly far astern of their intended targets. Let us hope similar booby traps can be devised to lure airborne missiles away from our big cities. Maybe we can hang noise makers on man-launched satellites or the moon. Another type of torpedo, for use against convoys, where many ships were crowded together in a small space, ran straight till it got to the middle of a convoy, and then darted around like a ferret in a chicken yard, making erratic figure eights until it plunked one of the many ships trying frantically to maneuver out of its way, and at the same time to avoid colliding with each other. Torpedo exploders also went through various stages of development. At the beginning of the war, they were percussion affairs, and the torpedo had to physically hit the side of the target to make them work. If the torpedo depth control mechanism was inaccurate, and the eel ran too deep, it could pass smack under the target ship and go on harmlessly beyond. Early in the war, the Germans had trouble with their depth mechanisms, the same as we did, and many a U-boat skipper saw fat targets get away from him after a perfect approach and well-aimed shot because the torpedo ran deeper than the setting he had put on it. These skippers returned to port spouting curses at the torpedo designers, just as ours did. No matter what his nationality, if you give a submarine skipper a defective torpedo, he'll damn your eyes to his dying day. To counteract erratic depth performance, the Germans developed a new type of exploder, which didn't have to hit a ship, but merely had to come close. Like the magnetic mine, it was fired by passing through the magnetic field that surrounds a ship. If it passed 10 or 15 feet under a ship, it would explode the warhead and break the ship in two. This worked for a while, but then it and the magnetic mine were countered by demagnetizing all our ships. We wrapped electric cables clear around the ship fore and aft, and kept a heavy current flowing through them, setting up a man-made magnetic field exactly opposite to that induced in the ship by the magnetic field of the Earth, thus sterilizing the ships so they would not fire the magnetic exploders. For a while, the demagnetized ships caused the U-boat skippers to damn their own designers again, when they should have been cursing the Allied countermeasure boys. Designers of new weapons and designers of the countermeasures for them are never more than half a jump ahead of each other. It is a deadly continuous battle of wits that absorbs the best scientific brains on both sides. We bring out a new weapon, catch the enemy flat-footed with it, and for a while that takes a heavy toll. Then the enemy's countermeasure people figure out how to confound it, and the weapon is useless, except that our own countermeasure people are busy too, and they knew the Achilles heel of this new weapon when they brought it out, foresaw the countermeasure to it, and are ready with a counter to the countermeasure. It's a scientific chess game involving a lot of mind reading and calculated risks, with thousands of lives at stake, which has been in progress ever since man has been inventing weapons. Up to now, almost every revolutionary new weapon since Hannibal's elephants, gunpowder, the machine gun, and the airplane, to name only a few, have been hailed as the ultimate weapon which would make war so terrible it would be banished from the earth. We seem to have such a weapon now in the H-bomb. But the lesson of all previous history is that we will develop other things that will enable us to live, and to die, with the H-bombs. Strange to say, this new magnetic torpedo firing device of the Germans was not new at all. The U.S. Navy had developed it long before World War II, but in an attempt to gain complete surprise when and if we ever used it, and to be sure the enemy wouldn't have a countermeasure ready for it, we clamped a super-duper top-secret label on it. In general, the fewer who know a secret, the better chance you have of keeping it. In this case, to confine the knowledge closely, tests of new firing mechanism were run by a small group under laboratory conditions which nearly, but not quite, duplicated wartime conditions at sea. Our submariners knew nothing about this device until war broke out, and the ordnance experts smugly handed it to them and said, "Here you are, boys. You don't even have to hit with this. Just come close." But the first few patrols by our subs in the Pacific proved there was a bug in the mechanism. Our skippers came ashore tearing their hair out by the handful, telling of daring attacks they had made, perfect approaches on fat targets, torpedoes running hot and straight smack under the target, but no boom. The scientists blamed it on faulty adjustments by the submariners, so the boys went out and risked their lives again, getting the same result. A rhubarb of some proportions developed, and for a time our submariners regarded our own Bureau of Ordnance as hostile forces. Meantime, the Germans, with no knowledge at all of our great secret, developed the same thing themselves, except theirs worked. And so it goes in this battle of brains. Smart people sometimes outsmart themselves, and Lady Luck is always hovering over their deliberations, ready to upset the apple cart with some outrageously improbable cast of the dice. Another little gadget you find in a torpedo is the arming device. You can't afford to cruise around in a submarine with 20 torpedoes fully armed and ready to explode from any slight jar or some magnetic fluke that could be caused by the aurora borealis. So the detonating cap which originates the explosion of the warhead is kept a few inches away from the hammer, which will strike and fire it eventually. Even if the cap fired itself in this position, it wouldn't detonate the warhead. On the nose of the torpedo warhead there is a small propeller-like water vane, which turns when the torpedo drives itself through the water. The shaft of this vane has a screw thread connected to the detonating cap, and as it turns it moves the detonator into line with the firing device, completing the alignment after the fish has traveled a safe distance from the firing sub. This device may have saved the U-505 from a premature end. One day in 1942, while attacking a ship in the Caribbean, one of her own torpedoes ran erratically, and some of her crew think it turned back and hit her square amidships. But the U-505 had a rendezvous to keep with destiny, and her number hadn't yet come up. So the screw thread hadn't quite finished unwinding, and all the sub got out of it was a dent in one of her ballast tanks. Some people think the ocean depths are sepulchral, noiseless voids where eternal silence reigns. How wrong they are. If you lower a sensitive microphone into the ocean, you can hear many sounds. Maybe you even hear the heartbeat of this planet. If the scientists are right when they say all life originated in the sea. Water is an excellent conductor of sound. The submarines and their hunters both made constant use of this fact. The noises made by the screws of a ship can be heard many miles in an underwater microphone. The noises of the machinery and people inside her, transmitted into the water by the ship's hull, can also be heard at a great distance. Breaking waves make noises, and so do many kinds of fish. Schools of shrimp make rhythmic throbbing sounds that are very similar to the screws of a ship. The ocean has temperature, density, and salinity layers that sometimes trap sound and channel it for phenomenal distances. The ability to hear is of vital importance to a submarine, and all submarines are equipped with a sensitive array of listening devices. Very often they can hear an approaching ship much further than they can see her even when fully surfaced. When a sub goes deep to evade an attack, the only way she can tell what goes on up on the surface is by sound. The principal means used by surface vessels for finding submarines submerged is the sonar gear. The guts of this apparatus is housed in a dome which sticks out a few feet below the keel of the surface ship. A gadget inside the dome makes a ping, which spreads out in all directions through the water. The sonar operator, in a compartment just above the keel, surrounded by banks of delicate instruments, watches his outgoing ping spread out on a videoscope like the ripple from a pebble on a pond. If there is nothing out there but seawater of uniform temperature, density, salinity, and emptiness, he gets no echo and pings again. But occasionally, after hours of endless pinging, he gets an answering echo. Pong. All this pong tells him is that there is something out there besides emptiness. But whether it is a ship, a school of fish, or a temperature gradient is up to him to figure out. The direction from which the echo returns tells him the bearing of the something, and the time interval from ping to pong, multiplied mechanically on a computer by the speed of sound in water and divided by 2, tells him its range. An expert sonar man can often tell from the quality of his echo whether he has got a school of fish, a thermocline, or a submarine. By listening without pinging, you can often find out a lot more of interest. You can hear the sound generated by a propeller driving a ship through the water, and count the revolutions per minute it is making. The sound expert on submarines can tell the skipper, from the screw noises he hears, how many screws the ship has, and whether it is a plodding, harmless merchant vessel, which he can safely attack, or a prowling high-speed destroyer, which he had better avoid. When the sonar operator on a destroyer gets a solid pong echo, he listens for screw noises. If he hears them, he knows he has got a submarine. unless it turns out to be a school of talking shrimp. A friend of mine who had a destroyer squadron out around Guadalcanal in the early days of the war tells a story about the strange sounds you can hear from the ocean's depths. He says that one day it was the good fortune of his group of cans to witness the most colossal bit of romancing, at least so far as physical bulk is concerned, that ever takes place on this earth: the mating of two whales. This creates quite a commotion in the water, because the whales go at it enthusiastically. While all the watchstanders on the bridges of the destroyers were eagerly training spyglasses and binoculars on this rare sight, the sonar operators down below, conducting their routine probe of the ocean's depths, bounced a ping off the two great fish and reported unidentified echo on the precise bearing and distance of the amatory leviathans. Then, in accordance with regular procedure, they quit pinging and listened. My friend swears that his experts on underwater sound reported screw noises. The behavior of sound in water is a field of science which absorbed the effort of our best scientific brains in Vannevar Bush's OSRD. In water of uniform temperature, pressure, and density, sound travels at a constant speed in straight lines. But the ocean seldom duplicates standard laboratory conditions. Usually the temperature of the water decreases as you go down, and this will cause a sound beam projected just under the surface to curve down and go deep till it either dissipates itself or hits bottom. Sometimes you get inversions, and the temperature increases as you go down. Then your sonar beam curves up, hugs the surface, and you may get echoes from unusually long ranges. A surface vessel with its sonar and ears at a fixed depth has to do the best it can with water conditions as it finds them. A submarine can sample the water all the way from the surface down to about 300 or 400 feet and cruise at the depth where it finds the best listening conditions on a particular day. The submariners in the new atomic submarines we are building now claim they will hardly ever surface, except maybe to leave and enter their home base. They say they will stay down several hundred feet all the time where listening conditions are best, will find and stalk their targets by the screw noises, and will sink them by firing acoustic homing torpedoes without ever actually seeing the target. I tell them this may be possible theoretically, but that it won't work in the U.S. Navy. They will have to surface after each shot because the boys in the Pentagon won't believe their claims on sinkings unless the submariners can produce photographs for the public info boys to put in the newspapers. Underwater explosions can sometimes be heard for phenomenally long distances, under proper conditions for several thousand miles. A sinking ship makes characteristic noises as her boilers explode and parts of the hull are crushed in by the terrific pressure as she goes down. So when a global war is in progress, with hundreds of ships being sunk and depth charges being scattered all over the ocean, it's no wonder that the ocean reverberates with strange noises. The fishes must wonder what man is up to. You can tell that sound is of great importance to a submariner from reading any book about submarines. It is full of words designed to suggest the noises heard under the sea. Ka-chung, ka-chung, ka-chung is the day-long beat of the diesels. Thum, thum, thum is the noise made by high-speed propellers approaching for an attack. Ping is an ominous warning from a destroyer's sonar gear. Kerblam, crump, whang is a salvo of depth charges close aboard. To a great extent, sound takes the place of sight as the main link with the outside world to the men who live inside a pressure hull. Radio is another link that connects a submarine to the outside world. Submarines can receive certain types of long-distance radio transmissions when they are shallowly submerged. And while receiving them, they put out no indication of their location. But to transmit an answering message, they must surface, or at least stick a whip antenna above the surface. When they do, their neck is out as soon as they hit the key of their transmitter, because they are then linked to friend and foe alike. If you have direction finders all around the edge of the Atlantic Ocean, constantly on the alert for any message on the known submarine frequencies, it takes only a few seconds for 3 or 4 of them to swing their loops and get a good bearing on the source of the message. These far-flung stations flash their readings to a central plotting room, where experts on a 24-hour alert can soon lay a small polygon down on your chart of the Atlantic, which probably contains a submarine. Many a sub went to the bottom a few hours after sending a routine message in mid-ocean because of information furnished by our direction finder networks. Laymen may ask, why didn't the Germans set up a similar system to tell their submarines where our killer groups were? They just didn't control enough of the world's geography to do it. We occupied the whole rim of the Atlantic and could get simultaneous bearings from all around a German sub. The Germans in France could only get one bearing on our subkillers, and it takes 2 or more intersecting bearings to give you a fix. A layman listening on a radio circuit hears a jumble of dots and dashes as monotonous and humdrum as rain on a roof. But to a radio operator, there is a rhythm and beat to every incoming message that is just as peculiar to the man who is sending it as the sender's voice. Radio men call this characteristic beat the sender's fist, and it identifies him to his contemporaries as surely as his fingerprints. Our direction finder operators got to know the fists of many U-boat radiomen. So in addition to locating a U-boat that surfaced to transmit a message, even though they could often tell you which U-boat it was, even a U-boat's radio transmitter also has its own individuality. You can seldom detect this by ear, but if you make a tape recording of a transmission and blow it up many times on an oscilloscope, the experts can put their finger on any other transmissions from that particular radio set. The moral of all this is that whenever you touch a radio transmitting key in wartime, you are announcing not only your location, but also your name, rank, and serial number, if the enemy is as alert as he should be. This is why all navies make a fetish of radio silence. Hitler's inability to understand this caused an upheaval in the German High Command that resulted in his sacking of Raeder as the naval commander-in-chief. When the cruiser Hipper and the pocket battleship Lutzow intercepted one of our Murmansk convoys, they were driven off by much inferior British forces, and the BBC immediately broadcast this stirring naval victory to the world. Hitler, who was pretty well fed up with the impotence of his surface navy by this time, heard this broadcast and demanded that Raeder get an immediate report from the flagship Hipper, giving their version of the battle. The Hipper was keeping radio silence while returning to port, and Raeder refused to order her to break it until she reached safe waters. Meantime, Der Führer fumed and waited, his fury against the surface navy mounting under skillful needling by Göring. When the Hipper finally got to port, Hitler and all his top brass gathered around the teletype machine in his headquarters to get the long-awaited news. Just as it started coming in, the teletype circuit to Norway went dead for several hours. Adolf blew his top, threw a tantrum that was memorable even for him, and heaved Grand Admiral Raeder out of his job. There is another side to the radio silence business. As related above, you could sometimes hurt yourself by too deep a silence. In the Jeep carrier task groups, we used our radios almost promiscuously. You can't operate an aircraft carrier and accomplish anything worthwhile unless you do. You've got to talk to your planes in the air and give them landing instructions. You've got to let them test their radio sets right after launching and make sure they are working. Otherwise, when one of them finally spots a submarine 100 miles from the ship, after several weeks of hunting, you experience the utterly frustrating experience of having him fly back to the ship and send you a blinker message saying, "There was a submarine out that way an hour ago, but she's gone now." This business of uninhibited radio traffic with our planes is what we military experts call a calculated risk. We knew that there was some chance the enemy might hear our transmissions, but we weighed this chance against the known fact that there was little use flying airplanes if you couldn't talk to them and decide to use radio. As things turned out, we were right, so this was a calculated risk. The U-boats used their radios too much, so this was not a calculated risk. The definition of a calculated risk is a gamble which military men take when they can't figure out what else to do, and which turns out to be right. When it turns out wrong, it wasn't a calculated risk at all. It was a piece of utter stupidity. The German scientists were slow getting wise to the facts of life about radar. For a long time, they wouldn't believe that British destroyers were equipped with it. German technology was way behind the British in this field, and all the radars their scientists knew anything about were too big to put aboard small ships. Even after sad experiences convinced the unscientific U-boat sailors that the British had seagoing radar because destroyers were charging straight at them out of the Arctic mists, the experts in Berlin gravely assured Admiral Dönitz that airborne radar was impossible. But it didn't take many attacks on his U-boats by aircraft on pitch-black nights to convince Dönitz that the experts were wrong again. At his urgent insistence, the scientists developed radar detectors which were eventually installed in all U-boats. To install active radar sets rather than detectors would have been suicidal. Planes and surface vessels would home on the magnetic pulses sent out by such jets. Radar works on the same principle as sonar, except in a different element. A radar set emits an electromagnetic ping into the atmosphere and waits for an answering magnetic pong from some reflecting surface. Anytime you make a radar ping, you risk giving away your location, the same as you do when you put our fist on a radio transmitting key. But a radar detector is a passive device, which puts out no indication that it is operating. It's like the listening gear of a submarine, as opposed to the active sonar of a surface ship. An active radar puts out a pulse of energy, gets an echo, and measures the number of microseconds between the pulse and the echo. A radar detector simply picks up the original pulse and indicates that a transmitting set is somewhere in the vicinity. It can't tell you how far away the transmitter is because it has no way of knowing just how many microseconds ago the pulse was triggered. To compensate partly for this, the detector picks up a pulse about twice as far away as the triggering set can detect a usable echo. The detector works on the original outgoing pulse, whereas the active set must detect and measure a weak echo, with only a fraction of the energy in the outgoing pulse. These radar detectors sometimes did more harm to the Germans than they did good. Their warnings saved some U-boats from surprise attacks at night, but they also caused many a U-boat to crash dive for an aircraft many miles away, and to stay submerged for hours when there was no real danger at all. All a radar receiver tells you when it shows a blip is that there is a radar transmitter somewhere within about 50 miles of you. From about the middle of 1943 on, Allied aircraft were so thick over the Atlantic shipping lanes that it was a fairly good bet there would be an aircraft within 40 or 50 miles of any U-boat that surfaced near the shipping lanes. And all the U-boat skippers knew this. But when they surfaced and got a blip on their radar receivers, their heartbeat increased and they submerged forthwith. It's one thing to know before you blow your tanks and come up that there will probably be an enemy aircraft within 50 miles of you. It's a much more urgent thing when you break surface to see a little dancing blip on the scope, confirming the fact that you were right, but leaving you in doubt as to whether he is a mile or 50 miles away. You will probably assume he is half a mile and get below again as fast as you can. Dönitz and his experts finally got so panicky about radar that they conjured up hobgoblins that didn't exist. When the Allies shifted the frequency of their radar transmitters beyond the range of the Germans' detectors, the Nazis wrongly suspected their own passive receivers of putting out signals which the Allies could detect. Several of their U-boats were surprised on dark nights by aircraft equipped with new high-frequency radars which had produced no blip on their detectors. The Nazi scientists jumped to the conclusion that their receivers were somehow enabling Allied aircraft to home on their subs. They junked one type of receiver and developed another called Naxos, of which more later. Actually, we never detected any usable signs from the German radar receivers, despite the suspicions of the Nazi longhairs. So much for the mechanical insides of the U-505 when she started her training in the Baltic. The essential facts about the U-505 type sub were: A. She was primarily a surface vessel. B. She was compelled to surface for several hours in every 24 hours to recharge her batteries. C. She had no snorkel. D. She could go down to about 600 feet. E. She had excellent listening gear and only primitive radar detectors. F. Her primary armament was 21 torpedoes, but at first she also carried a 4-inch gun.